She finally got her chance. After 7 years of carrying plates, refilling water glasses, smiling at customers who treated her like furniture, and watching restaurant owners ignore every single idea she'd ever suggested, everything was about to change. But then his mother called. And everything collapsed in exactly 48 hours. Before we start, let me ask you something in the comments down below. What city are you watching from right now? I'm genuinely curious. And at the very end of the story, I need you to rate it from 0 to 10. I want to know if you believe love can actually survive jealousy, family interference, and the kind of manipulation that comes from someone who refuses to let go of control. Let's find out together. This is the story of Elisabetta Colombo, Matteo Rossini, and the woman who thought she could burn down two people's worlds just because she couldn't accept that her son had finally chosen someone other than her. The restaurant was called Della Nonna, which means grandmother's place. It sat on a narrow street in the old quarter of Turin, Italy, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a small gelato shop that had been there since 1987. The walls were cream-colored, decorated with black and white photographs of Turin from the 1950s. The tables had red and white checkered tablecloths. The kitchen smelled like basil, garlic, and burning wood from the pizza oven. And standing behind the bar, wearing a black apron with flour smudged across her chest, was Elisabetta Colombo. She was 32 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark brown hair that she always tied back in a loose bun because she never had time to do anything else. Her eyes were the color of espresso, sharp and observant, noticing everything. The way customers shifted uncomfortably when they didn't like the food, the moment a waiter's smile became forced, the exact second when someone stopped enjoying themselves. She'd worked at Della Nonna for 7 years. 7 years of arriving at 5 in the morning to prep vegetables. 7 years of staying until midnight cleaning tables and organizing the walk-in freezer. 7 years of watching owners come and go, watching managers take credit for her work, watching other staff members get promoted while she remained stuck in the same position, earning the same salary, staring at the same 4 walls of the dining room day after day. The owner before the current one had promised her a management position. Elisabetta had believed him. She'd worked extra hours without pay. She'd rewritten the entire menu based on her suggestions. She'd trained new servers, organized the wine selection, implemented a new reservation system that actually worked. Then he sold the restaurant and disappeared. The new owner, a man named Vincenzo who was more interested in his phone than his business, had looked at Elisabetta like she was part of the furniture. "You're good at what you do," he'd said once, which was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever received from him. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Her apartment was a studio with water stains on the ceiling and a heating system that only worked when it felt like it. Her refrigerator was mostly empty except for leftover pasta and black coffee. She had 3 pairs of shoes, one for work, one for walking, and 1 pair of heels she hadn't worn in 4 years because there was nowhere to wear them. She had a dream, though. The dream sat in a notebook hidden under her mattress, filled with sketches of a restaurant that didn't exist yet. A restaurant where the owner actually cared about the food, where the staff was valued, where creativity wasn't seen as threatening, where a person like Elisabetta could be more than invisible. That's where things were when Matteo Rossini walked through the door of Della Nonna on a Tuesday evening in March. He was tall, probably 6 feet 1, with dark hair that looked like he'd just run his fingers through it. He wore an expensive dark blue suit that clearly wasn't Italian. The cut was too sharp, the fabric too refined. He had the kind of watch that made you understand why some people were richer than others. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and there was something in them that suggested he was constantly thinking about 3 different things at once. He wasn't the most handsome man Elisabetta had ever seen. He was something different. He was the kind of man who looked like decisions were easy for him, like complications disappeared when he walked into a room. He came alone, which was unusual. Most men like him came with business partners or women trying to impress him. He sat at a corner table, ordered a bottle of wine without looking at the wine list, and studied the menu with the kind of focus that made Elisabetta understand he actually cared about what he was about to eat. It wasn't the casual, indifferent browsing of most customers. This was someone evaluating something, judging it, taking it seriously. Elisabetta was working the section where his table was located. When she approached, He looked up from the menu and something in his expression shifted slightly. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Elisabetta had spent 7 years noticing small things. She noticed it. "Good evening," she said, keeping her voice professional and distant. "What can I get for you?" The man set down the menu slowly. "Before I order," he said, speaking Italian with a slight accent she couldn't quite place, "I need to know something. Who made the menu?" Elisabetta blinked. It wasn't the question she'd expected. "The owner, Vincenzo," she answered, even though it wasn't entirely true. Vincenzo had ordered the menu from a printing company. He hadn't changed a single item in 3 years. "And who decided the wine selection?" the man asked, studying her face. "The owner," she answered again, which was definitely not true. She had reorganized the entire wine selection 2 years ago when she'd finally convinced Vincenzo that 23% of their customers were leaving because they were tired of drinking cheap wine. He'd approved it with a shrug and hadn't asked about it again. The man smiled. It was a small smile, knowing. "My name is Matteo Rossini," he said, extending his hand across the table. Elisabetta hesitated, then shook it. His hand was warm, his grip firm but not aggressive. "And I suspect," he continued, "that you're the person who actually designed that menu and selected those wines." Elisabetta felt her face get hot. She tried to pull her hand back, but he held on for just a moment longer. "I don't know what you mean," she said, which was what she was supposed to say. Propriety. Professionalism. The rules she'd learned to follow. "Of course you do," Matteo said, releasing her hand. "You're the one who actually cares about this place. I can tell because you're the only person in this restaurant who looks like they want to be here." It was the kind of observation that made Elisabetta uncomfortable because it was true. She stepped back. "I'll bring your wine," she said, turning away. "Wait," he called after her. She turned back. "What's your name?" "Elisabetta," she answered. "Elisabetta," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "That's a strong name. A name for someone who builds things instead of serving them. Don't you think?" She didn't answer. She went to get his wine. The rest of the evening, Matteo was a perfect customer. He didn't try to flirt. He didn't make demands. He ordered the risotto with mushrooms, the branzino, and the tiramisu for dessert. He tipped 30%. He left his business card on the table with a handwritten note that said, "This place has potential. You're the reason why. Call me if you ever want to discuss that restaurant in your notebook." Elisabetta's hands shook when she found the card. Matteo Rossini, founder and CEO of Rossini Real Estate Development. Turin-based. International projects. 37 years old. She turned the card over and over, reading the handwritten message again and again. She should have thrown it away. She should have pretended it never happened. Instead, she put it in her pocket. When she got home that night, she called him. "I wondered if you would," he said, and she could hear him smiling through the phone. "Most people are too afraid to make the first move." "I'm not calling about the restaurant," she said quickly. "I'm calling to tell you that you shouldn't make assumptions about people based on 5 minutes of interaction." 3 minutes, he corrected. "You made your judgment in the first 3 minutes I was at your table. The other 2 you spent avoiding eye contact." Elisabetta wanted to hang up. Instead, she found herself saying, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," he answered. "Why do you care? About the restaurant, about me, about any of this? You're clearly successful. You don't need another business." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Because I spent 15 years building something with my mother," he said finally. "Building something she was supposed to help me maintain. And then she stopped being interested in the business and became only interested in controlling me. She wanted me to be a certain way, marry a certain person, make a certain type of money, live a certain type of life. And somewhere in all of that, I realized that the happiest I'd ever been was when I was creating something new, something that didn't exist before, something that was completely mine. So when I walk into a restaurant and I see someone who looks like they're dying to create something but nobody's giving them the chance, I notice. Because I remember what that feels like." Elisabetta was quiet for a long time. I don't know you, she said softly. I know, Matteo replied. But we could change that. Have dinner with me. Not at Della Nana. Somewhere else. Somewhere where you're not working and I'm not being analyzed by the owner wondering why I'm here. She should have said no. She should have said something professional and distant. Instead, she said yes. The first date was at a small restaurant in the Quadrilatero district, far away from Della Nana, far away from anyone who might see them. Matteo showed up 15 minutes early and stood by the window watching the street. When he saw Elisabetta approaching, he smiled like he'd been waiting his whole life for her to arrive. She was wearing the heels. The ones she hadn't worn in 4 years. They'd seemed like a risk, but as he looked at her that way, they felt like the right choice. You're beautiful, he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. Elisabetta had heard, you're pretty, before from men trying to compliment her. This was different. It wasn't a casual observation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same confidence with which he probably closed business deals. You look like someone who's about to say something difficult, she said, sitting down. I am, he admitted. So I'm going to say it directly because I think you appreciate directness. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you walked away from my table. That's unusual for me. I'm generally very focused. Very controlled. But you completely disrupted that. And I'm not sure if that's the best thing that's ever happened to me or the worst thing, but I'd like to find out. Elisabetta's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the water glass. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you're ambitious, Matteo said. I know you're observant. I know you notice when people are happy or sad or struggling. I know you care about details. I know you're scared of something, but I haven't figured out what yet. I know you took a risk calling me instead of throwing my card away. And I know that you wore those heels for a reason. That's enough to start. They talked for hours that night. Matteo told her about his father, who had died 10 years ago. About his mother, Vittoria, who had become suffocating in her grief, trying to control every aspect of Matteo's life as compensation for losing her husband. About how he'd built his real estate business not because he wanted to be rich, but because he wanted to prove to himself that he could create something independent of her influence. About his 2 failed relationships, both with women who had ultimately agreed with his mother that he was too ambitious, too detached, too focused on work. Elisabetta told him about her childhood in a small town outside Turin. About her parents, who had run a small cafe. About watching them work 16-hour days and never complain. About learning that the restaurant business was in her blood, but that it was also a trap if you weren't careful. About the 7 years at Della Nana and how each year had felt like being buried a little deeper. About the notebook under her mattress and the dream that felt further away every single day. What would your restaurant be? Matteo asked, leaning forward. It would be seasonal, Elisabetta said, and for the first time, she said it out loud to someone other than herself. The menu would change every 3 months based on what's in season. Not because it's trendy, because it actually matters. The kitchen would be open, so customers could see the food being prepared. The staff would be treated like artists, not servants. We'd pay them well. We'd give them benefits. We'd listen to their ideas. And the wine list would be personal. It would tell a story. Every wine would have a history, and I would tell people those stories. Matteo listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. We're going to build that, he said. Elisabetta laughed, but not because it was funny. Because it was impossible. You don't even know if I can actually cook, she said. Can you? Matteo asked. Elisabetta hesitated. I've never had the chance to prove it professionally, she admitted. But my parents taught me. Food is the only language I've ever felt completely fluent in. Then we're going to build it, Matteo said again. Starting tomorrow. What he meant by starting tomorrow was that he spent the next week studying the Turin real estate market. By the following Tuesday, he'd identified 3 perfect locations. One was a small building that had housed a family-run bookstore that had closed 5 years ago. It had high ceilings, natural light, and the kind of bones that suggested good bones underneath. The walls were a depressing gray, But Elisabetta could see past that. She could see the restaurant. She could see it perfectly. "We could do it," she said, standing in the middle of the empty space. Matteo was watching her face, not the building. "We could actually do it." "We're going to do it," he corrected. "But first, you need to resign from Della Nana." Elisabetta turned to him. "That's insane," she said. "I have no savings. I have no business experience. I have no idea how to run a restaurant." "You have better ideas than 95% of restaurant owners in this city," Matteo said. "You have the support of someone who can handle the business side, the financing, the legal structure. And you have me, which is more valuable than any of that because I actually believe in you." She quit Della Nana on a Friday. She told Vincenzo that she was leaving to pursue other opportunities. He barely looked up from his phone. "Fine," he said. "We'll find someone else." Just like that. 7 years. Gone. She walked out of that restaurant and didn't look back. The next 3 months were chaos. Beautiful, terrifying, perfect chaos. Matteo hired contractors. Elisabetta designed the kitchen layout, down to the exact positioning of the stoves. They fought about the color of the walls. He wanted sophisticated gray, she wanted warm cream. The cream won. They disagreed about the bar design. She wanted wood, he wanted steel and glass. They compromised on reclaimed wood with glass shelving. Every argument felt like they were building something real because they were. Matteo never kissed her during those 3 months. He held her hand. He stood very close when they looked at drawings together. He told her she was brilliant so many times that she almost started to believe it. But he didn't cross that line. When she finally asked him why, one evening while they were painting the kitchen, he said, "Because the moment I do, everything changes. And I want you to be absolutely certain that you're choosing me for the right reasons. Not because you're caught up in the moment or because I helped you build your restaurant. I want you to choose me completely awake." She kissed him first. She painted a stripe of cream-colored paint across his jaw by accident while reaching for something on a high shelf, and when he turned to look at her, annoyed, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was soft and careful and tasted like paint and possibility. "Completely awake?" she asked when she pulled back. "Completely awake," he confirmed. Then he kissed her again, and it was different. It was the kind of kiss that felt like a promise. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday in September. Elisabetta had spent the previous night unable to sleep, walking through the space over and over, checking that everything was exactly where it needed to be. Matteo had found her at 4:47 in the morning, standing in front of the stove, and he'd held her without saying anything because there was nothing to say. They both knew what this moment meant. This was proof that Elisabetta was more than invisible. This was proof that dreams actually had the capacity to become real. The first night, the restaurant was half full. Tourists who had found them online, locals who were curious about the new place, food critics who hadn't been invited but had shown up anyway. Elisabetta cooked in a state of focused precision. The risotto with mushrooms and truffle oil was perfect. The branzino with lemon and white wine was perfect. The pasta was perfectly al dente. The desserts, delicate panna cotta, creme brulee with lavender, were absolute revelations. She moved through the kitchen with a grace that made it look easy, even though everyone could see it wasn't. People watched her work through the open kitchen window. They pointed. They smiled. They understood they were watching something rare. By the 3rd week, they had a waiting list 2 months long. Within 2 months, the restaurant was one of the most talked about places in Turin. Food critics from Milan came to eat there. Journalists called it a revelation. One magazine called Elisabetta the most important chef to emerge in Turin in the last decade. She was 32 years old, and suddenly she wasn't invisible anymore. That's when Matteo's mother called. Her name was Vittoria Rossini, and she was 68 years old with gray hair cut in a precise bob and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been disappointed by everyone in the world, including and especially her son. She had not been told about Elisabetta. She had not been introduced to the restaurant. She had learned about her son's new serious relationship from a magazine article that featured a photograph of them holding hands in the dining room. The article had called them the power couple of Turin's food scene. Vittoria did not like surprises. She did not like that her son was in a serious relationship with a woman she hadn't selected for him. She did not like that he was emotionally invested in a restaurant that had nothing to do with the family business. She did not like that his attention and energy were being directed toward someone other than her. "Your mother is coming to dinner," Matteo told Elisabetta, and she understood immediately that something had shifted in his tone. This wasn't excitement. This was dread. "When?" she asked, already understanding the answer. "Saturday night," he said. "She called this morning. She's making it very clear that she considers this a formal introduction." Elisabetta had never been nervous about cooking before. Cooking was the one thing in her life where she felt completely confident. But that Saturday she was nervous. She changed the menu 4 times. Matteo told her to stop, to trust her instincts, but she couldn't. She wanted to impress Vittoria. She wanted to prove that she was worthy of Matteo's attention. She wanted to prove that this relationship wasn't a distraction. It was the most important thing. Vittoria arrived 20 minutes early, which meant Elisabetta was still in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her hair escaping from its tie, her clothes already showing signs of the dinner service she hadn't even started yet. When Matteo brought his mother into the kitchen, Vittoria's eyes scanned Elisabetta with the kind of thorough evaluation that made it clear she was assessing everything. The flour, the messy hair, the simple black kitchen clothes, the hands that smelled like cooking. "So you're Elisabetta," Vittoria said, and she didn't extend her hand for a greeting. She held her purse in front of her like a shield. Elisabetta wiped her hands on her apron and extended them anyway. Vittoria didn't shake them. She smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile that predators use before they strike. "Matteo has told me so much about you," she said, which was clearly a lie. Matteo had told her nothing. "Yes, well," Elisabetta said. "I hope you enjoy dinner." "I'm sure it will be interesting," Vittoria said, in a tone that made it clear she was expecting anything but. The dinner was spectacular. Elisabetta had prepared a 7-course tasting menu that was some of her best work. There was a beautiful cacio e pepe with fresh pasta she'd made that morning. There was a slow-roasted lamb with rosemary and white beans. There was an exquisite seafood pasta with clams and mussels from the Ligurian coast. Every course was perfectly balanced, beautifully presented, clearly crafted with love and precision. Vittoria ate it all without commenting. She didn't praise. She didn't ask for the recipe. When Elisabetta came out between courses to check on her, Vittoria was polite but distant. At the end of the dinner, Matteo walked his mother to her car. Elisabetta watched them from the window of the dining room. She could see Matteo's body language change. Could see him shift into the role of son rather than partner, lover, supporter. Could see him become smaller in his mother's presence. "She hates me," Elisabetta said when he came back inside. "She doesn't hate you," Matteo said, but he didn't sound convinced. "She's just protective of me, of the family legacy, of things she thinks matter." "Does she think I matter?" Elisabetta asked. He didn't answer immediately. "She thinks you're a distraction," he said finally. "She thinks this restaurant is taking me away from the business, from responsibility, from what I should be doing." "And what do you think?" Elisabetta asked. Matteo came toward her and took her hands. "I think my mother has spent 68 years trying to control everything and everyone around her, and I'm not going to let her start with you." But it had already started. The next week, an article appeared in a business magazine. It claimed that Matteo had funded the restaurant as a vanity project to impress his new girlfriend. It suggested that he'd abandoned his real business interests. It included quotes from anonymous sources in the real estate industry, saying that his recent projects had lost focus and direction. It ended by asking whether the promising young developer had finally lost his edge to love and distraction. Matteo knew exactly who had leaked the story. His mother had connections in every industry in Turin. She had friends who would do anything for her. She was signaling clearly that she had resources and that she was willing to use them. "Don't react," he told Elisabetta. "It's what she wants. If you react, if you get angry or defensive, the story becomes about you. It becomes about her being right that you're a distraction. We stay calm. We let the article die. We move forward. But Elisabetta could see the tension in his face. Could see the way he was already calculating the damage. Could see him thinking about his mother in a way that made it clear that the business, the real estate development company that defined his adult life, was already being threatened. 3 days later, another article appeared. This one was about the restaurant. A food critic who had previously given them a glowing review had now written a scathing piece claiming that the restaurant had lost its focus, that the menu was becoming inconsistent, that Elisabetta was spreading herself too thin. The article mentioned that she had never trained formally as a chef, that she had no professional credentials, that her success was more about novelty than actual skill. Elisabetta knew who had arranged that review before Matteo even told her. Vittoria had orchestrated this. Vittoria had made sure that the positive press they'd been receiving was replaced with doubt. Vittoria was systematically dismantling the thing that Elisabetta had built. Don't react, Matteo said again, but she could see that he was struggling with his own advice. He was starting to take calls about the business more frequently. He was checking his phone constantly. The easy confidence that he'd shown when they were building the restaurant together was being replaced with anxiety. The articles kept coming. An investigation into whether Matteo's real estate company was using questionable practices. A piece about the restaurant's ingredient costs suggesting that Elisabetta was financially reckless. A story about how other restaurants in Turin were losing business because all the attention was going to the new place, with some chefs suggesting that the novelty would wear off soon. It was coordinated. It was deliberate. And it was working. 2 weeks after the first article, Matteo stopped coming to the restaurant every night. Then he stopped coming at all. When Elisabetta called him, he said he had to focus on the business. When she asked if his mother was responsible, he said it didn't matter who was responsible. What mattered was that the articles had damaged his reputation, and he needed to repair it. What mattered was that his partners were losing confidence. What mattered was that he'd made a mistake letting emotions override business sense. You don't mean that, Elisabetta said, standing in his apartment, which suddenly felt cold and hostile. I mean that my mother is right about some things, Matteo said, and each word felt like a knife. I did get distracted. I did let this become more important than my responsibilities. I did make decisions based on you instead of based on what was actually smart. We made those decisions together, Elisabetta said, her voice breaking slightly. Those were our decisions. They were right. I'm not sure anymore, Matteo said quietly. Elisabetta left his apartment and went directly to Della Nonna, the restaurant where she'd spent 7 years invisible and underappreciated. Vincenzo was there, checking his phone as usual. When he saw her, he looked surprised. I want to come back, she said. She needed something stable. She needed something that didn't depend on anyone else's belief in her. She needed to survive. Vincenzo rehired her with barely a comment. She was back in the same position she'd left, with a 4% raise that felt like an insult. She wore the same apron. She carried the same plates. She became invisible again. But at least invisible was safe. It took Matteo exactly 1 week to realize what he'd done. He walked into the restaurant one evening and saw Elisabetta moving between tables with an expression of complete resignation. She looked smaller somehow. Diminished. Like someone who had finally accepted that the dream she'd been reaching for was never going to be within her grasp. He ordered a table for one and sat down. When Elisabetta came over, she was professional and distant, the mask she'd learned to wear. I made a mistake, he said without preamble. I did exactly what my mother wanted me to do. I let her convince me that loving you was a liability instead of an asset. I let her make me small. I let her win. Elisabetta didn't respond. She just stood there, waiting for him to order. The restaurant is closing, Matteo said quietly. I couldn't keep it open without you. I couldn't even be in the space without thinking about how wrong I was. Elisabetta felt her heart crack a little more. Then you need to go back to your real business, she said. Salvage what you can. Your mother's right about some things. Maybe it was a distraction. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. That's not true, Matteo said, and he stood up and walked out without ordering anything. The next morning, Matteo did something that shocked the entire Turin business community. He called a press conference. He announced that he was stepping back from his real estate business. He announced that he was taking a leave of absence. He announced that the only thing that mattered to him was rebuilding the restaurant and rebuilding his relationship with Elisabetta. But he did one more thing. He released the emails. Every email his mother had written to journalists. Every email she'd sent to business contacts asking them to damage his reputation. Every email in which she'd explicitly planned the attack against him and Elisabetta. He released them all to the press, and the Italian media exploded. Vittoria Rossini, the respected widow, the pillar of society, was suddenly exposed as someone who had systematically sabotaged her own son's happiness out of spite and jealousy. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Friends stopped calling her. Business contacts distanced themselves. The exclusive club she belonged to for 30 years quietly suggested that her membership might not be renewed. She became the person everyone whispered about at parties. She became invisible. Or rather, she became visible in the worst possible way. Matteo didn't care about any of that. What he cared about was Elisabetta. He showed up at Della Nonna the morning after he released the emails. He found her in the kitchen, preparing for the lunch service. He didn't say anything. He just asked if she could take a break. They went to the rooftop of the building, where the sun was starting to burn off the morning fog. "Your mother," Elisabetta started, but Matteo held up his hand. "Is no longer my concern," he said. "I love you. I chose you. I'm choosing you right now. And I'm going to keep choosing you unless you tell me you don't want to be chosen." Elisabetta wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this time would be different. But she'd been hurt. She'd been abandoned. She'd been made invisible again. "What if the business fails?" she asked. "What if the restaurant closes? What if the dream dies?" Matteo took her hands. "Then we'll find a new dream," he said. "But we'll do it together. And even if we fail, I won't let you become invisible again. I promise you that." He kissed her there on that rooftop overlooking Turin, with the sun breaking through the clouds, and it felt like a beginning instead of an ending. They closed the other restaurant. It was Elisabetta's decision. She didn't want to be associated with Vincenzo anymore, and she didn't want to spend her days somewhere that felt like surrender. Instead, she and Matteo reopened their own restaurant. Not in the same location. That had become too complicated with the financial complications of the first closure. But in a new space even better than before. They called it simply Colombo, which was Elisabetta's last name. It was a statement of ownership and identity. The reopening was a massive event. The food journalists who had turned on them because of Vittoria's manipulation came back, and they were ashamed. The first review of Colombo was written by one of the most respected critics in Italy. He wrote, "This is not just a restaurant. This is a statement. This is a woman who was told she didn't matter, told that her dreams were too big, told that she should accept invisibility, and she refused. Elisabetta Colombo has created something that will last not because of novelty, but because of excellence and integrity. This is the kind of place that changes a city." The restaurant thrived. Within a year, it was impossible to get a reservation. Elisabetta trained a team of chefs who believed in her vision. She implemented the benefit system she'd always wanted to implement. She paid her staff well. She listened to their ideas. She created a community. Matteo didn't come back to his real estate business. He didn't want to. Instead, he became a partner in the restaurant. He handled the business side while Elisabetta handled the food. They worked together. They built together. They created together. A year after the reopening, Matteo proposed to Elisabetta. He did it in the restaurant after the last customer had left, in front of all the staff who had become like family. He got down on one knee and pulled out a simple ring, not ostentatious, not trying to prove anything, just beautiful and honest. "I was weak," he said. "I let fear and family obligation make me do something I'll regret for the rest of my life. But you came back. You gave me another chance. And I promise you, Elisabetta, for the rest of our lives, I will never let anyone make me small enough to hurt you again." She said yes. Of course, she said yes. Vittoria Rossini died 2 years later. Not dramatically. Not in any way that made the news. She simply faded, become less and less relevant until she was barely relevant at all. Matteo didn't cry at her funeral. He sat next to Elisabetta and held her hand, and afterward, he said that he had already grieved the loss of his mother a long time ago. She had chosen control over connection. She had chosen jealousy over love. And in the end, that choice had isolated her completely. Elisabetta and Matteo had 3 children together, 2 daughters and 1 son. They grew up in and around the restaurant. They grew up watching their mother and father work together, compromise with each other, build something beautiful together. They grew up understanding that love wasn't about control. It was about choice. It was about choosing every single day to show up for the person you loved. The restaurant Colombo is still there in Turin. It's been featured in international restaurant guides. It has a Michelin star. Elisabetta still cooks most nights, though she's delegated more responsibility as the years have passed. Matteo still handles the business side. They still argue sometimes about things. The color of the walls got changed twice more. They compromised on the wine list yearly. They made decisions together. And sometimes, late at night after the restaurant had closed, they would sit at one of the tables and talk about how close they'd come to losing each other. How nearly Vittoria's jealousy and manipulation had destroyed them. How it would have been so easy for Matteo to stay small in her shadow forever. How it would have been so easy for Elisabetta to accept invisibility. But they didn't. They chose each other. They chose courage. They chose to build something real. So here's what I want to ask you in the comments section. Do you believe love can survive jealousy and family interference? Do you think Matteo made the right choice stepping away from his business to be with Elisabetta? And most importantly, do you think Elisabetta was right to give him a second chance? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Let me know what you thought. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because there are so many stories like this one. So many moments where love has to be brave enough to stand up against everything else. I'll see you next time.